Warren Buffett has said for decades that the most important thing about money is not how much you make, but how much you keep. And it took me until I was 71 years old, sitting across from a tax accountant who had just shown me a number I was not prepared for, to understand what that principle actually meant when applied to the specific act of withdrawing from retirement savings. My name is Howard. I am 78 years old. And the 5 things I'm going to tell you about today are the 5 moves I either did not make, made too late, or made in the wrong order before I touched my retirement savings, and what each of them cost me in ways that were entirely preventable. I spent 29 years as a senior loan officer at a regional bank in North Carolina. I understood money in a professional sense. I understood interest rates and amortization schedules and the mathematics of compound growth. I had spent the better part of 3 decades advising other people on the financial decisions of their lives, mortgages, business loans, lines of credit, and I had done it well. When I retired at 67, I had a 401k, a rollover IRA, a small pension from the bank, and Social Security. By most measures, I was prepared. Size. What I was not prepared for was the specific and consequential set of decisions that sit between the moment you stop working and the moment you take your first dollar out of your retirement accounts, because those decisions, the order in which you withdraw, the tax treatment of each account, the rules that activate at certain ages, the designations on the paperwork you filed years ago are not intuitive. They are not well explained by the institutions holding your money, and the cost of getting them wrong is not a one-time loss, but a recurring and compounding one. The first move is one that almost nobody makes in a formal and deliberate way before they begin withdrawing. And it is the one that would have saved me the most money if I had done it correctly from the start. It is building a withdrawal order strategy, a deliberate, written, sequenced plan for which accounts you draw from first, second, and third, and in what proportions, based on the tax treatment of each account. Most people approaching retirement have money in at least 2 different types of accounts. A traditional pre-tax account like a 401k or traditional IRA, where every dollar withdrawn is taxed as ordinary income, and sometimes a Roth account where qualified withdrawals are completely tax-free, and taxable brokerage accounts where the rules are different again. The order in which you draw from those accounts over the course of your retirement determines how much of your own money you keep and how much goes to taxes. It is not a small difference. The conventional wisdom, draw from taxable accounts first, then pre-tax, then Roth last, is a reasonable starting point, but it is not a strategy. A real strategy accounts for your specific tax bracket in each year of retirement, your projected Social Security income, whether you have a pension, your RMD obligations beginning at 73, and whether strategic Roth conversions in the early years of retirement, before those obligations kick in, would reduce your lifetime tax burden. I did none of this planning formally before I began withdrawing at 68. I drew from my traditional IRA first because it was the largest account and the most accessible, without fully accounting for the tax treatment of those withdrawals in combination with my pension and my Social Security income. The result was that in my first 3 years of retirement, I was in a higher effective tax bracket than I needed to be, paying ordinary income tax on IRA withdrawals at a rate that a better sequenced approach would have substantially reduced. The accountant I eventually sat across from at 71, a retired tax specialist named Richard, who had built a practice specifically around retirement income planning, looked at my withdrawal history and my account balances and said something I have never forgotten. He said the money was still there, but the taxes I had already paid on it were gone. And taxes paid unnecessarily are the one financial loss in retirement that cannot be recovered. He was right. The dollar amounts involved in my first 3 years of suboptimal withdrawal sequencing were not catastrophic, but they were real, they were unnecessary, and they were the direct result of not having a written withdrawal order strategy before I took the first dollar. The second move is one that many retirees know exists but treat as something to address later, until later becomes urgent. Required minimum distributions, what the IRS calls RMDs, are mandatory annual withdrawals from traditional pre-tax retirement accounts that begin at age 73 under current rules. And the amount you must withdraw each year is calculated by dividing your account balance by a life expectancy factor published by the IRS. The penalty for failing to take your RMD in any given year is substantial, historically 50% of the amount you should have withdrawn, recently reduced but still severe. What most people do not think about until they are close to 73 is how their RMD obligations will interact with their other income sources and what the tax implications of those forced withdrawals will be. I turned 73 2 years into what had already become a pattern of drawing primarily from my traditional IRA. The arrival of mandatory RMDs on top of my existing withdrawal pattern pushed my taxable income in those years higher than it needed to be, which in turn affected the taxation of my Social Security benefits and triggered IRMAA surcharges on my Medicare premiums, which is the income-related monthly adjustment amount, a Medicare premium surcharge that applies when your income exceeds certain thresholds. I had not understood before retirement that my IRA withdrawals would count as income for IRMAA purposes. The surcharge in the first year it applied to me added just over $2,000 to my annual Medicare costs. Had I understood the RMD implications and the IRMAA thresholds before I began withdrawing, I would have managed my withdrawals in the years before 73 to reduce the account balances subject to RMDs through Roth conversions or simply more strategic early withdrawals, and potentially avoided or reduced that surcharge entirely. The third move is the one that Richard the accountant emphasized most strongly when we finally sat down together, and it is the move that requires the most planning time because its benefits are greatest when it is executed in the window before RMDs begin. It is the deliberate and strategic use of Roth conversions, moving money from a traditional pre-tax IRA into a Roth IRA, paying the income tax on the converted amount now in exchange for tax-free growth and tax-free withdrawals for the rest of your life and for the life of whoever inherits the account. The mathematics of Roth conversion are genuinely compelling for people who retire in their early to mid-60s with a gap of several years before Social Security, pension income, and RMDs all arrive together and push their taxable income higher. Curious, that gap is a window of relatively lower income, potentially the lowest income years of your adult life, during which converting traditional IRA money to Roth at a lower tax rate than you will face later can reduce your lifetime tax burden considerably. I did not execute a single Roth conversion in the 5 years between my retirement at 67 and my first RMD obligation at 73. I had heard of Roth conversions. I understood the concept. I did not act on it because it felt like paying taxes voluntarily on money I had not yet touched, and that instinct, while understandable, was incorrect. The conversions I could have made in those 5 years at a 15% effective rate would have reduced the balance subject to mandatory RMDs at 73 and every year since, reduced the Medicare surcharges I have paid, and left a larger tax-free balance for Carol, my wife, to inherit. Richard estimated that the conversions I did not make in those 5 years represented a lifetime tax cost of somewhere between $18,000 and $24,000, depending on how long I live. That is not a number I can recover, but it is a number you can avoid if you are reading this before your window has closed. The fourth move is the one that sounds the simplest, and that people most consistently either skip entirely or underfund. And it is maintaining a dedicated emergency fund outside of your retirement accounts before you begin withdrawing from them. The reason this matters more than most people appreciate is rooted in something called sequence of returns risk, which is the risk that a significant market decline in the early years of your retirement, combined with your need to continue withdrawing to cover living expenses, permanently impairs the long-term value of your portfolio in a way that cannot be recovered even when markets eventually return to their previous levels. The mechanism is straightforward. If your portfolio drops 30% in the first 2 years of retirement and you are withdrawing 4% annually to live on, you are selling assets at depressed prices to fund your withdrawals. When the market recovers, you have fewer shares to recover with. The retiree who goes through the same market decline but has 2 to 3 years of living expenses in cash outside the portfolio, in a high-yield savings account or short-term treasury instruments, can stop or reduce withdrawals during the downturn and wait for recovery without selling at the bottom. The difference in long-term portfolio value between those two retirees over a 20-year retirement is not marginal. It is substantial. I entered retirement with what I considered an adequate cash reserve, about 6 months of expenses. And the first significant market correction I experienced in retirement, that reserve was depleted within 8 months, because I had not fully accounted for the expenses that accumulated in that period. I continued withdrawing from my IRA during the downturn because I had no alternative. The shares I sold during that period at depressed prices were shares that would have recovered significantly in the following 18 months. Building a true 2 to 3 year emergency reserve outside retirement accounts before you take your first withdrawal is the single most effective protection against sequence of returns risk available to an individual retiree. It costs you some current yield on that cash. What it protects is the long-term integrity of the accounts you spent a career building. The fifth move brings me back to the subject of Arthur, a colleague from the bank who retired 3 years before I did, and whose situation I described in a conversation I had with Richard at our second meeting. Arthur was meticulous. He had a spreadsheet for everything. He had reviewed his investment allocation, his Social Security timing, his pension options. What he had not done in all that preparation was review and update the beneficiary designations on his retirement accounts. He had named his first wife as the primary beneficiary on his IRA in 1997. He had divorced in 2004 and remarried in 2007. He had updated his will. He had updated his life insurance. He had not updated his IRA beneficiary form because it was a separate form held by a separate institution, and it simply did not make it onto the list. Arthur died at 74. His IRA, which represented the majority of his retirement savings, passed to his first wife because the beneficiary designation on file with the institution was the legally controlling document. His current wife received nothing from that account. The estate contested it. The legal process was long, expensive, and unsuccessful. I watched this happen to a man I had worked alongside for 20 years, and I sat in my own chair that evening and went online and pulled up the beneficiary forms for every account I owned. What I found was that my IRA still listed my mother as a contingent beneficiary. She had died 4 years earlier. My 401k rollover listed our adult son as a primary beneficiary at equal share with Carol, which is not what Carol and I had discussed or intended, because the form had been filled out before our financial picture had evolved to its current state. Neither of these designations was catastrophically wrong, but neither was current, and neither reflected our actual intentions. I updated every form that evening. It took 90 minutes. It is a kind of task that feels administrative and therefore deferrable, right up until it is not deferrable at all. I am 78 years old. I spent 29 years as a banker advising other people on financial decisions, and I still walked into retirement making 4 of the 5 moves I have described today, either incorrectly or not at all. The withdrawal order strategy I did not build. The Roth conversion window I did not use. The RMD implications I did not model in advance. The emergency reserve I underfunded. The beneficiary forms I had not looked at in years. Each of these was correctable in advance, and each became progressively harder to correct after the fact. The reason I am telling you this is not because I believe you are careless or uninformed. I am telling you because I was neither of those things, and I still made these mistakes. Because the specific information required to avoid them is not presented clearly or in sequence by the institutions that hold your money. And because the cost of each mistake compounds quietly over time, in a way that is easy to miss until it is too late to do much about it. Warren Buffett's principle that what matters most is not how much you make, but how much you keep, applies to the accumulation phase of your financial life, but it applies with equal and perhaps greater force to the distribution phase, to the years when you are drawing down what you spent a career building. The 5 moves I have described today are the 5 decisions that determine how much of what you built you actually get to keep. They are all doable. They all require time and attention rather than expertise. And every one of them is easier to do before you take your first withdrawal than after. If you are within 5 years of retirement, or if you retired recently and have not yet addressed all 5 of these, the time to do it is now, not when the RMDs arrive. Not after the market correction. Not the morning after the phone call that changes everything. Now, while the window is still open and the decisions are still yours to make thoughtfully and without pressure.